Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unbreakable You. If you are joining me live or watching the replay later, I am so glad that you are here today. Today, I want to talk about something that so many people experience but don't always fully understand. And I started this topic slightly last week when we talked about different attachment style. Today, I want to focus on why do we attract emotionally unavailable partners. So many people say things like, why do I keep meeting the same type of person? Why does the relationship start so beautiful and then suddenly they pull apart or they pull away? Why do I give so much emotionally, but it doesn't feel like the other person can meet me at the same level? If these questions sound familiar and you want to know the answers to it, stay tuned. When this happens again and again, it can actually make people feel so confused, hurt, and sometimes even question themselves. But what many people don't realize is that attraction is not always based on what is healthy for us. A lot of times, attraction is based on what feels familiar to the nervous system. I want to talk about why emotionally unavailable partners often feel attractive, and there is a hidden emotional pattern behind this dynamic. And I also want to cover how can you begin attracting emotionally available relationship. And this is something I work on with a lot of women and men recently as well in my Unbreakable You coaching program. Because when you change your internal emotional patterns, your relationships begin to change as well. So let's start with this question: why emotionally unavailable partners feel so attractive? And one of the biggest misconceptions about love is that attraction happens purely because of the person. But very often, what attracts us is actually the emotional dynamic. Emotionally unavailable people often creates that intensity and uncertainty. And unfortunately, our nervous system actually mistakes that intensity for love. I want to give you an example before you say that doesn't make sense. When someone is inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, it creates this emotional high and low. When they give you attention, it feels incredibly exciting. When they pull away, it creates this anxiety and the desire to reconnect again. This pattern actually creates a powerful emotional cycle in the brain. And psychologists refer to this as intermittent reinforcement. It's the same psychological mechanism that used in gambling. You never know when the round will come to you to win. So your brain keeps trying harder. And this is one reason emotionally unavailable relationships can feel incredibly attractive. I want to give you a couple of stories that you can reconnect and understand this. So maybe that would make sense on why that is happening. So at the beginning of such relationships, it feels perfect. Let me share with you something that many people will recognize. Sometimes emotionally unavailable relationships start so incredible. You meet someone, and in the beginning, it feels like magic. The conversations are deep, the connections feel so strong. You feel like the person actually truly sees you. And you think to yourself, wow, finally, this is the person I've been looking for. But slowly, something begins to change. The messages become less frequent, the emotions start opening, and now it becomes a little more faded. And when the relationship begins becoming deeper, the other person begins pulling away. And suddenly, you are left to feel confused. You start wondering, what happened to this person that I met in the beginning? What many people don't recognize is that emotionally unavailable partners often just feel comfortable in the early stages of connection, when things are just exciting and very fun. But when real emotional intimacy starts growing, their nervous system begins to feel very overwhelming. And that's why they start creating distance. And the person on the other side just begins trying harder to reconnect. And this is where the painful cycle begins. We talked about that last week, and this is the very common type of dynamics of the avoidant and the anxious attachment styles. So let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced a relationship where the more you tried to connect, the more the other person pulled away? If that's something you experienced, you definitely are not alone. Feel free to comment below to let us know. You don't have to share the story, but it just helps to know and see how many people are dealing with that. Now, there is another reason that we attract emotionally unavailable partners, and that's something that's called emotional familiarity. Our nervous system really recognizes emotional patterns from our earlier life or earlier in life when you were younger, or even childhood. Sometimes the emotional dynamic that we experience growing up becomes the emotional dynamic that we create in our adulthood. So, for example, if love in childhood felt inconsistent, distant, unpredictable, your nervous system just associated that with the emotion of feeling the love. So when someone is emotionally distant, it may feel strangely familiar to you. Not because it's healthy, but because it's something that your nervous system can recognize. And when someone is emotionally available, calm, consistent, that can actually feel very unfamiliar at first, very strange. Some people even say things like, this relationship is too calm, or something feels missing. But what they're actually experiencing is emotional safety, which is when the nervous system doesn't recognize this particular calmness as love. One of the most common relationship pattern, as I mentioned, is the anxious avoidant dynamic. This happens when someone who deeply desires connection meets someone who just struggles with emotional closeness. The anxious partner seeks the connection, the avoidant partner just seeks some space. The more one person moves closer, the more the other pulls away. And this creates this cycle where both people are reacting from their emotional patterns. I remember noticing this pattern in my own life. At one point, I was in a relationship where I cared deeply about the person. I wanted emotional closeness, communication, connection. But the person that I was with had a very different emotional pattern. Whenever the relationship started becoming deeper, more emotional, he would pull away. And when he pulled away, I felt anxious and tried reconnecting again. So the more I moved forward, the more I moved towards his emotionally, the more he created that distance. And the more distance he created, the more I felt like I need to get closer. I need to close that gap. So it became this invisible cycle, and it was emotionally exhausting. But understanding that attachment style really helped me realize something very important. It wasn't that I was too emotional, and it wasn't simply that the other person was unwilling. Our nervous system had learned very different ways of responding to closeness. And without awareness, those patterns can repeat again and again. Sometimes people wonder how they can recognize emotional unavailability earlier. There are some signs that you can recognize very early on. So, for example, difficulty expressing emotions. If somebody just doesn't express their emotions or doesn't tell you how they feel, avoiding any deep conversation, when you have this inconsistency in communication, pulling away when the relationship becomes serious, fear of commitment, or even keeping the relationship in like a surface level, emotionally unavailable people can say things like, I'm not ready for something serious, or I just need some space, or even I'm not good at relationships. A lot of times, these are not really excuses, these are actual signals about emotional capacity. The challenge is that many people believe love means waiting for someone to change. Emotional availability cannot be forced. It is not on you to help the other person become emotionally available. The first step is to recognize that that individual is not available emotionally and give them that space to heal. So, how do we begin changing this pattern of attracting emotionally unavailable people? The most important shift actually starts internally. We don't attract emotionally healthy relationships by trying harder. We attract them by changing our emotional alignment. And the first step begins with healing your emotional patterns. When emotional wounds are unprocessed, they influence the patterns that we feel drawn to. Healing actually means understanding your emotional patterns and developing self-awareness. As you heal, your standards start changing. You stop chasing emotional uncertainty. And that's when you recognize emotional safety. Because healthy love often feels very different from intense chemistry. It feels consistent, it feels calm, it feels very respectful and emotionally safe. And sometimes this can feel unfamiliar at first, or maybe you can feel it as not being attractive, but emotional safety is actually the foundation of healthy love. I once spoke with someone who told me something very interesting. She said, I met someone who is so kind, consistent, emotionally present, but I feel like something is missing. And when we explored that feeling, she realized something very surprising. What felt missing was actually the emotional chaos that she had. And she became very used to that emotional chaos. So when there was no emotional highs and low, no guessing games, no dramatic tension, just calm, respectful connection, and her nervous system didn't even recognize that as love. But over time, she actually started realizing that emotional safety is what healthy love actually looks like. And once you experience that, it becomes very difficult to go back to emotionally unavailable relationship. So the third step of creating that emotional available relationship is to set emotional boundaries. Healthy relationships require mutual emotional effort. Instead of just trying to convince someone to love you, to care for you, to answer you, you choose a relationship where emotional presence already exists. And boundaries actually protect your emotional well-being. And lastly, this will actually strengthen your self-worth. When someone truly values themselves, they stop accepting relationships that do not meet their emotional needs. Self-worth changes the entire dynamic of attraction. Because when you believe that you deserve emotionally healthy love, you stop settling for less. This type of emotional healing is exactly the work that I do with women in my Unbreakable You coaching program. And I've done that on my own as well. Many women I work with come to me after experiencing emotionally unavailable partners, painful breakups, betrayals, or even repeated relationship patterns. Together, we worked on understanding emotional dynamics, rebuilding confidence, and learning how to open the heart again without actually losing yourself. Because the goal is not to move on from pain, the goal is to become stronger, wiser, and emotionally free. I want to leave you with that reminder. Don't believe if somebody says that you are too much. You are not too emotional. You are emotional. You are not too sensitive, and you are not too much. You may simply have been given your love to people who did not have the capacity to receive it. And when you begin healing your emotional patterns, something very powerful happens. You begin attracting different relationships. Relationships that feel safe, respectful, consistent, and emotionally fulfilling. And this is what becoming unbreakable truly means. Before we finish today, reflect on this question. What emotional patterns might be influencing the pattern that I feel attracted to? Thank you for joining me today, and I will see you again soon.